3 of our teaching on exposing the kingdom of darkness. We're going to continue by looking at the pyramid structure that is behind the system that governs the Western world. Specifically, we're going to look at the lower half of the pyramid that appears on the back of the US $1 bill. The bottom half of the pyramid on the back of a US $1 bill represents the various steps of Freemasonry. So we're going to look at the various steps and levels of Freemasonry and what is required in each step in order for an individual to reach the highest degree of Freemasonry, which is a 33rd degree Mason. The process begins at the Blue Lodge. The journey into Freemasonry begins as what is known as the Blue Lodge. The Blue Lodge is the foundation of all Freemasonry. These are the many local lodge groups scattered across the country in almost every little town and city. When a person wants to become a Freemason, he is initiated into the Blue Lodge through 3 degrees. The first degree is called Entered Apprentice. The second is referred to as the Fellowcraft degree. And the third degree is called a Master Mason. In order to join the lodge, each Mason must first be initiated through an initiation ceremony, which is similar throughout the world. The original initiation ceremony for one to enter into a Masonic lodge is called the cable tow. The typical ceremony begins with the initiate being first divested of his jacket and his tie and any money or metal articles that he has. His left trouser leg is then rolled up over the knee, his shirt is open to expose his left breast, and his right shoe is removed and replaced by a slipper. Then the person who is to be initiated will have a blindfold put on him, and then a noose will be put around his neck. And this is called a cable tow. The blindfolded initiate, they call this being hoodwinked, is brought with the noose around his neck to the outer door of the lodge. The candidate, thus attired, is said to be in darkness, an allegory of Masonry that signifies that everyone outside of Masonry is in darkness, and only Masons have the true light of the world. So the new Mason is brought to the outer door, seeking the light of the lodge, and there the doorkeeper, or Tyre, will put a sword or a sharp point to his breast, and lead him into the lodge room where an altar sits in its center. The lodge members await the candidate in the darkness that surrounds the altar, which is lit from a single light above. Behind the altar stands a man called the Worshipful Master. He is the master of the lodge and presides over the initiation. The entered apprentice vow, in order to enter into the first level of the Blue Lodge, includes the following words: binding myself under no less a penalty than having my throat cut across, my tongue torn out of its roots, and buried in the rough sands of the sea. Then the vow of the Fellowcraft degree, which is the second level of the Blue Lodge, includes the following words: binding myself under no less a penalty than that of having my left breast torn apart, my heart plucked out and given as prey to the wild beasts of the field and the fowls of the air. And then one seeking the third degree of the Blue Lodge, that is, the Master Mason, vows the following: binding myself under no less a penalty than that of having my body severed in twain, my bowels taken from thence, and burned in ashes. Once an individual becomes a third-degree Master Mason, he is obligated to protect other Masons. The Master Mason who achieves the third degree of the Blue Lodge takes an oath requiring him to protect his fellow Mason or himself by committing one or more felonies, including perjury, suborning witnesses and jurors, concealing the felon, tampering with physical evidence and bribery, and as a judge or juror, allowing oneself to be influenced. Next, I'm going to share with you what Albert Pike, in his book published in 1871 entitled Morals and Dogma of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, who he himself became a 33rd degree Mason, explains regarding the understanding of the blue degrees of Freemasonry. In March 1858, Albert Pike was elected a member of the Supreme Council of the Southern Jurisdiction of the United States for the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. Pike also wrote lectures for all the degrees, which were published in 1871 under the title Morals and Dogma of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. In honor of Albert Pike and his contribution to Freemasonry, he has a statue in Washington, D.C. So in his book, Morals and Dogma, on page 819, he explains the following regarding the blue degrees of Freemasonry. The blue degrees are but the outer court or portico of the temple. Part of the symbols are displayed there to initiate, but he is intentionally misled by false interpretations. It is not intended that he should understand them, but it is intended that he shall imagine that he understands them. Pike goes on to explain from his book. Their true explication is reserved for the adepts, the princes of Masonry. It is well enough for the mass of those so-called Masons to imagine that everything is contained in the blue degrees. So next, I want to show you a layout of the Masonic tabernacle compared to Moses' tabernacle in the wilderness. On the left is the tabernacle of Moses, and the God of Israel commanded that you enter into his tabernacle on the east. In coming in from the east, the administrative functions of the tabernacle are on the west. However, in a Masonic tabernacle, you enter in the west. And the master mason, who is also called the worshipful master, he stands behind the altar in a position designated where he would be regarded as God. In the Bible, God is associated with the direction of east, and the Hebrew word for east is kadem. And often in the King James, the word kadem is translated as not only east, but as ancient. So that being the case, in Freemasonry, the master mason, or the worshipful master, sits on the east side of the Masonic tabernacle, thus sitting himself in the position of God. So back to Albert Pike's book, Morals and Dogma, where he explains the meaning behind the different levels of Freemasonry, he says on page 213, every Masonic lodge is a temple of religion, and its teachings are instruction in religion. He says on page 210 of his book, Masonry is the legitimate successor from the earliest times, the custodian and depository of the great philosophical and religious truths, unknown to the world at large and handed down from age to age in an unbroken current of tradition, embodied in symbols, emblems, and allegories. And then on page 311, he explains, we belong to no one creed or school. In all religions, there is a basis of truth. In all, there is pure morality. All teachers and reformers of mankind we admire and revere. Masonry has her mission to perform. She invites all men of all religions to enlist under her banner. So once you've made it through the Blue Lodge and have risen to being a third-degree Mason or a Master Mason, the Master Mason has a choice to stay in the Blue Lodge or to seek the advanced degrees through either the Scottish Rite or the York Rite. Within the Scottish Rite, there are the 4th through the 32nd degrees, and the 33rd degree is an honorary degree. On the other hand, York Masonry is the oldest and best known of all Masonic rites. It takes its name from York, England. The three primary bodies in the York Rite are the Chapter of Royal Archmasons, the Council of Royal and Select Masters, and the Knights Templar. In total, the York Rite has 13 degrees. Regarding the Royal Arch degree of the York Rite, in being initiated into this degree, the candidate is asked, "Are you a Royal Arch Mason?" To which the reply is, "I am that I am." So perhaps you may recognize these words as being a counterfeit of Exodus chapter 3, where in that chapter, Moses asked the God of Israel, "When the people ask me, 'What is your name?' what shall I say unto them?" And the King James translates Exodus chapter 3 verse 14, God said to Moses, "I am that I am." So from that we can see, in being initiated into the York Rite of the Royal Arch degree, you are proclaiming to be God. And then they reveal the sacred omnifit word, Jah, Baal, Lon. This is given in low breath and is performed 3 times by 3 lecturers, each taking turns to pronounce a name each. So 3 times it is stated, Jah, Baal, On. It is here that the secret name of the deity of Masonry is revealed, and that name is Jah Balon. The candidate is then told that it is the name of the deity in 3 languages. Jah is the short form of the Hebrew name of the God of Israel, which is Yahweh or Jehovah. Bol is the rendering of the Babylonian name Baal. On is the term used in Egyptian sun deity referring to Osiris. So on page 226 of Albert Pike's book, Morals and Dogma, explaining Freemasonry, he states that Freemasonry is Baal worship. Masonry, around whose altars the Christian, the Hebrew, the Muslim, the Brahmin, the followers of Confucius, and Zoroaster can assemble as brethren and unite in prayer to the one God who is above all, the Baalim, must needs leave it to each of its initiates to look for the foundation of his faith and hope to the written scriptures of his own religion. So now regarding the Knights Templar vow of the York Rite of Freemasonry, the Knights Templar candidate is forced to swear the following: If I ever willfully violate this my solemn compact as a brother Knights Templar, may my skull be sawn asunder with a rough saw, my brains taken out, in memory of St. John of Jerusalem, that faithful soldier of our Lord and Savior. And in continuation of the vow it is said, If I ever willfully deviate from this my solemn obligation, may my light be put out from among men as that of Judas Iscariot for betraying his Lord and Master. And then a human skull is then placed in the candidate's hand. He further declares, Furthermore, may the soul that once inhabited this skull as the representative of St. John the Baptist appear against me in the day of judgment, so help me God, and keep me steadfast in this my solemn obligation of a Knights Templar. Furthermore, Albert Pike, the 33rd degree Mason of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, addressing the 23 Supreme Councils of the world on July the 14th, 1889, stated the following: To you, Sovereign Grand Instructors General, we say this, that you may repeat it to the brethren of the 32nd, 31st, and 30 degrees. The Masonic religion should be, by all of us, initiates of the high degrees, maintained in the purity of the Luciferian doctrine. Yes, Lucifer is God. There is a temple of the 33rd degree Mason in Washington, D.C. for the Scottish Rite. In the United States, there are 2 Supreme Councils of the Scottish Rite. The Southern, or the Mother Council of the World, with headquarters in the House of the Temple in Washington, D.C., and the Northern, with headquarters in Boston, Massachusetts. Next, we're going to explain the Masonic letter G. And in the lower levels of Freemasonry, it is explained that the G stands for God in geometry. The letter G is significant in Freemasonry. In the lower degrees, the initiate is told that this letter stands for God and for geometry, which the supreme architect of the universe used to design this world. However, in the Mysteries of Magic by Eliphas Levi and interpreted by Arthur Edward Waite, he explains that the letter G, which Freemasons place in the center of the burning star, signifies gnosis and generation. It also signifies grand architect, for the pentagram, from whatever side it may be looked at, always represents an A. So gnosis in Greek means knowledge. And from gnosis we get the word Gnosticism. Albert Pike explains in Morals and Dogma that the Masonic letter G is a sexual symbol. He writes, The monad, number 1, is male, and the duad, number 2, is female. Their sexual union produces the triad, number 3, which is represented by the letter G, the generative principle. In the next slide is an examination of the back of a US dollar, and in forming a hexagram through and around the pyramid and the words around it, which means a new world order, in the inscription encoded spells a Mason. A representation of a sexual Masonic symbol is the point within a circle. The point in the circle carries a sexual connotation. The female principle, symbolized by the moon, assumed the form of a lunette, a small circular opening, or crescent, while the male principle, symbolized by the sun, assumed the form of a lingam, or a phallus, and placed himself erect in the center of the lunette, like the mast of a ship. This was explained in the Short Talk Bulletin, August 1931, in a Masonic bulletin designed to be read within the lodges on page 4. Next, we're going to reveal the relationship between sex, enlightenment, and the sun wheel. So a circle is commonly used to depict the female sexual organ. Buddhism and Wiccans believe in an 8-step path of enlightenment. For Wiccans, the 8th and the final step of enlightenment is the sexual act. Notice that at the center of the symbol is a small circle. So now, in the next slide, if we look at a physical layout of the Vatican in Rome, Italy, it is laid out with an 8-section sun wheel with a small circle in the middle. In the middle of the circle is an obelisk representing the male principle. Next, we're going to see how the Masonic symbols are associated with sex and the hexagram. To the Mason, the interlacing triangles of the hexagram depicts sexual intercourse. Masonic author Albert Mackey explains the following. The triangle pointing downward is a female symbol corresponding to the yoni, and the upward pointing triangle is the male, the lingam. When the two triangles are interlaced, it represents the union of the active and passive forces in nature. It represents the male and female elements. So this comes from Albert Mackey's book, The Symbolism of Freemasonry, printed in 1869, as well as Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma, printed in 1871. Next, we're going to look at Baphomet, which is a symbol of the Church of Satan. The word Baphomet may come from two Greek words, baphe and metis, meaning absorption of knowledge. The pentacle is surrounded by two circles, the innermost touching the points of the pentacle. In between the two circles are 5 Hebrew characters, spelling Leviathan anti-clockwise. In the Bible, Leviathan is a term referring to Satan. Baphomet is a symbol for the Church of Satan. In the occult, Baphomet is represented as a demon goat. Next, we're going to look closer at the Great Seal of the United States. The Great Seal of the United States is used to authenticate certain documents issued by the United States federal government. The design on the front of the seal is the coat of arms of the United States. On the front is an eagle whose dexter wing has 32 feathers, representing the number of ordinary degrees in Scottish Rite Freemasonry. The sinister wing has 33 feathers, which corresponds to the additional feather associated with the 33rd degree of the Scottish Rite conferred upon those who are regarded as having outstanding Masonic service. The tail feathers number 9. This is the number of degrees originally in the chapter, council, and commandery of the York Rite of Freemasonry. The stars above the eagle's head forms a hexagram, which is an occultic symbol. Next, we're going to see from the explanation of Freemasonry itself how the design of the dollar bill is associated with Freemasonry. In this slide is an image taken from the New Age magazine, which was the official publication of the Supreme Council of the 33rd degree of Freemasonry in the United States. It is now called the Scottish Rite Journal. In its April 1960 edition, it clearly states that the $1 bill is covered in Masonic symbols, and it also states that the pyramid is the Masonic all-seeing eye. Next, we're going to have a very detailed explanation of how Washington, D.C., specifically the Congress, the White House, and Supreme Court, are laid out in Masonic symbols. This information comes from the cuttingedge.org website. Let us now begin our study of Governmental Center, Washington, D.C. Beginning from the top left to the top middle. Number 1, we have DuPont Circle, Logan Circle, and Scott Circle in the middle, and it forms the top 3 points of the Devil's Goat Head of Mendes, one of the most important types of the 5-pointed Devil's pentagram. Number 2, Washington Circle forms the extreme left-hand point of the goat head. Number 3, Mount Vernon Square forms the extreme right-hand point of the goat head. Number 4, the White House forms the fifth and bottom point of the goat head. The Freemason architect who drew this pattern intended to show that governmental center was planned to be ruled by Satan. Further, the goat head pentagram was placed so that the southernmost point, the spiritual point, is precisely centered on the White House. The author who originally gave this explanation did not arbitrarily draw the lines to center on the White House. Rather, the White House is the precise point where the two lines formed by Connecticut Avenue flowing from DuPont Circle and by Vermont Avenue flowing from Logan Circle intersect. The meaning is all too clear. Occultists planned for the White House to be controlled by Lucifer in accordance with his occultic power and doctrine. The House of the Temple, which is the North American headquarters of Freemasonry, is also located 13 city blocks north of the White House. Count them yourself, beginning with the first city block north of Lafayette Square. Of course, the number 13 represents rebellion against God's authority and is generally thought of as Satan's number. It is no accident that the House of the Temple is located 13 blocks north of the White House. The occultic meaning transmitted is that the control of the White House would be spiritual and would emanate from the House of the Temple. Now let's look at the symbol contained in the lower right-hand portion of your Washington, D.C. city street map. This combination of symbols runs south and east from the White House to the United States Capitol. These are the symbols which clearly stamp Freemasonry upon the city, and which unmistakably reveal the brand of Luciferic worship, which we see in the goat head pentagram and the brand practiced by Freemasonry. Let us look at these Freemasonry symbols. The three most sacred symbols of Freemasonry are the compass, the square, and the rule or straight edge. Look at the United States Capitol and you will see that it is laid out in the form of a circle. This represents the top of a professional compass of that era, which was circular. Pennsylvania Avenue, running from the Capitol to the White House, represents one leg of the compass. Maryland Avenue, running from the Capitol to Thomas Jefferson Memorial, represents the second leg of the compass. In this instance, you will have to lay out a ruler and draw a solid line from the Capitol to the Jefferson Memorial to get the full effect. The Freemason Square begins at Union Square with Louisiana Avenue forming one arm and Washington Avenue the other. You will have to draw a line down Louisiana Avenue and Washington to see the fully formed square because Louisiana ends at Pennsylvania and Washington ends at Maryland. The critical 900 angle of the square is pictorially missing. However, once you draw the natural continuation of Louisiana and Washington beyond their termination points, you will see the 900 square perfectly formed. The Freemasons' rule or straight edge is clearly seen if you draw a straight line south from the Washington Center to the base of the Washington Monument and then straight east to the Capitol. Thus, all three of the sacred instruments of Freemasonry are depicted in the layout of these streets. As the person at the website is giving explanation of this Masonic layout, he comments that the deliberate planning of these governmental buildings so that they would be laid out so as to represent these three sacred tools of Freemasonry, coupled with the Luciferic goat head pentagram, clearly tells us that the brand of Luciferic control and worship planned for this capital city was Freemasonry. So let's summarize what we've covered in this section of the teaching. Number 1. Freemasonry begins at the Blue Lodge. Initiation is through the first 3 degrees. The first is called the Entered Apprentice degree. The second is called the Fellow Craft degree. The third is called the Master Mason degree. Number 2. The Master Mason, which is the 3rd degree, takes an oath to protect other Masons. Number 3. After going through the 3 degrees of the Blue Lodge, the Mason has the choice to stay in the Blue Lodge or to seek the advanced degrees through either the Scottish Rite or the York Rite. Number 4. Within the Scottish Rite, there are the 4th through the 32nd degrees, and the 33rd being an honorary degree. Number 5. The 3 primary bodies in the York Rite are the Chapter of Royal Arch Masons, the Council of Royal and Select Masters, and the Knights Templar. In total, the York Rite has 13 degrees. Number 6. According to Albert Pike, who was a 33rd degree Mason of the Scottish Rite. Freemasonry is a religion, is Baal worship, and teaches that Lucifer is God. Number 7. In the lower levels of Freemasonry, the Masonic letter G represents God in geometry. However, as revealed in the higher levels, it represents gnosis or knowledge. As well, it is a sexual symbol. Number 8. A Mason is encoded on the back of a US dollar in the area that contains the pyramid and the Latin phrase New World Order. Number 9. The point within a circle is a Masonic sexual symbol. Number 10. The hexagram is a Masonic sexual symbol. Number 11. Baphomet is a symbol of the Church of Satan. In the occult, it represents a demon goat. Number 12. The Great Seal of the United States is a Masonic symbol representing the Scottish and York rites of Freemasonry. Number 13. The pyramid and the all-seeing eye on the back of the US dollar bill is a Masonic symbol. And number 14, Washington, D.C., and specifically the branches of the U.S. government are physically laid out in Masonic symbolism. And the Washington Monument is an obelisk. So next, we're going to see how the pyramid on the back of the US dollar is a representation of the ideals associated with the Illuminati and Freemasonry. So we're going to begin by looking at Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati. Johann Adam Weishaupt founded the Order of the Illuminati on May the 1st, 1776 in Bavaria, Germany. Weishaupt was initiated in the Masonic Lodge at Munich in 1777. He desired to incorporate the ideals of the Illuminati with that of Freemasonry. The Illuminati refers to the Bavarian Illuminati, a secret society founded by Adam Weishaupt on May the 1st, 1776. The Illuminati's members took a vow of secrecy and pledged obedience to their superiors. Members were divided into 3 main classes, each with several degrees. Their symbol was the owl of Minerva. So given that the symbol of the Illuminati was the owl of Minerva, we're now going to look at the owl of Bohemian Grove. Bohemian Grove is a restricted 2,700-acre campground located in Monterey, California. It is a private men's club whose members consist of the global elite. In mid-July each year, Bohemian Grove hosts a more than 2-week encampment of some of the most prominent men in the world. Central in the 2-week encampment in Bohemian Grove is the cremation of care ceremony. It is a theatrical production in which some of the club's members participate as actors. It was first conducted in 1881. The ceremony takes place in front of the Owl Shrine. Since the founding of the club, the Bohemian Grove's mascot has been an owl. The demon goddess Lilith is represented throughout history as an owl. In the Bible, in Isaiah chapter 34, verse 14, it is written, "The wild beasts of the desert shall also meet with the wild beasts of the island, and the satyr shall cry to his fellow." And the King James translates the next part of the verse, "The screech owl also shall rest there, and find for herself a place of rest." So where the King James translates screech owl, it is the Strong's number 3917. It's the Hebrew word Lilith. And in the Strong's Hebrew dictionary, it explains that Lilith is the name of a female goddess known as a night demon, associated with the desolate places of Esau or Edom. So next we're going to look at the Bavarian Illuminati's roots in the United States. In 1785, the Lodge Columbia of the Order of the Illuminati in New York was founded. Among its members were New York Governor DeWitt Clinton, Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Daily Tribune, and Clinton Roosevelt, the ancestor of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Its name was, from the beginnings of the 20th century, Grand Lodge Rockefeller. Clinton Roosevelt wrote a book called Science of Government Founded on Natural Law, which was the blueprint of the conspiracy to eliminate the U.S. Constitution and to communize the country based on the principles of Weishaupt. It contained the detailed plan for the New Deal and the National Recovery Act. It was implemented 92 years later by his direct descendant Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He referred to himself and other members as the Enlightened Ones and said that the U.S. Constitution was a leaky vessel, which was hastily put together when we left the British flag, and therefore needs revision. Next, we're going to look at the goddess Columbia. Columbia is the female personification of the United States. It originated from the name of Italian explorer Christopher Columbus and from the ending IA, which is common in Latin in names given to countries. It was also a historical name applied to the Americas and to the New World. Washington, D.C., or the District of Columbia, is named after her. Columbia's association with the United States has given rise to the names of many persons, places, objects, institutions, and companies. Hail Columbia was regarded as the de facto national anthem of the United States until 1931, when the Star-Spangled Banner became the official national anthem of the United States. The goddess Columbia became the logo of Columbia Pictures. When Columbia Pictures adopted Columbia as its logo in 1924, she appeared and still appears as bearing a torch. To the Illuminati, the torch represents enlightenment. It is a symbol for Lucifer, who is regarded as the light bearer. Next, we're going to look at the logo of CBS, or the Columbia Broadcasting System. CBS's former legal name was the Columbia Broadcasting System. This name was first used in 1928. In 1951, CBS began to use the all-seeing eye as the company's trademark symbol. The all-seeing eye is known as the Eye of Providence. In ancient Egypt, it represented the Eye of Horus. To the Illuminati, it is a symbol for the New World Order or One World Government. So the next slide is a representation of the pyramid of the hierarchy of the New World Order. And in the next slide is the chart form of the hierarchy of the New World Order and some of its component parts. So given that Satan is the king of Babylon and the king of the kingdom of darkness, and that Babylon has many facets, levels, layers, and tentacles, we are now going to look at the financial tentacle of the Babylonian system. And we're going to begin by looking at the history of modern banking. Banking, in the modern sense of the word, can be traced to the medieval and early Renaissance Italy, to the rich cities in the north such as Florence, Venice, and Genoa. The Bardi and Peruzzi families dominated banking in 14th century Florence, establishing branches in many other parts of Europe. Perhaps the most famous Italian bank was the Medici Bank, established by Giovanni Medici in 1397. Originally, the charging of interest known as usury was banned by Christian churches in Europe. The original banks were merchant banks, which were first invented in the Middle Ages by Italian grain merchants. As the Lombardy merchants and bankers grew in stature based on the strength of the Lombard Plains cereal crops, many displaced Jews fleeing Spanish persecution were attracted to the trade. They brought with them ancient practices from the Middle and Far East silk routes. Originally intended for the finance of long trading journeys, these methods were applied to finance the production and trading of grain. The Jews were forbidden to hold land in Italy, so they entered the great trading piazzas and halls of Lombardy alongside the local traders and set up their benches to trade in crops. Banking offices were usually located near centers of trade, and in the late 17th century, the largest centers for commerce were the ports of Amsterdam, London, and Hamburg. The Berenberg Bank in Italy was established in 1590. The Bank of Amsterdam was founded in 1609. The Bank of England was established in 1694, and it became the first privately owned central bank in the world. Court Jews were Jewish bankers or businessmen who lent money and handled the finances of some of the Christian European noble houses, primarily in the 17th and 18th centuries. Examples of what would later be called court Jews emerged when local rulers used services of Jewish bankers for short-term loans. One of the most notable families engaged in this activity was the Rothschild family that created a banking empire that had branches all over Europe. The Rothschild family, known as the House of Rothschild, or more simply as the Rothschilds, is a European dynasty of German Jewish origin that established European banking and finance houses starting in the late 18th century. Mayor Amschel Rothschild, who lived from 1744 to 1812, was raised in Frankfurt's Jewish ghetto. His original name was Mayor Amschel Bauer. Bauer is a German name that means peasant or farmer. He adopted the surname of Rothschild, taking that name from a sign with a red shield that hung over the door to his business establishment. He was the son of Amschel Moses Bauer, born in 1710, who was a money changer. Court Jews handled money for European royalty and nobility. During that era, Jews were legally required to live in small communities that were separate from Christians. They were also not allowed to leave their villages at night, on Sundays, or on Christian holidays. He won the patronage of Crown Prince Wilhelm of Hesse, gaining the title of court factor in 1769. As a pioneer of international finance, Mayer developed a finance house and spread his empire by installing each of his 5 sons as his agents in the 5 major financial centers of Europe. The eldest, Amschel Mayer Rothschild, set up his operations in Frankfurt, Solomon Mayer Rothschild in Vienna, Nathan Mayer Rothschild in London, Kalman Mayer Rothschild in Naples, and the youngest, Jacob Mayer Rothschild in Paris. The 5 linked their branches and became the first banking entity to transcend national borders. Mayer Amschel Rothschild, who lived from 1744 to 1812, was famously quoted as saying, "Give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who writes the laws." The Rothschilds were high-ranking Freemasons. In the Masonic reference book 10,000 Famous Freemasons, Volume 4, page 74, indicates 2 other sons of Amschel were Masons, James Mayer Rothschild and his brother Nathan Mayer Rothschild. Furthermore, James Rothschild in Paris was a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Mason. Next, we're going to look at Rothschilds and a modern banking timeline. We begin in 1770, where Mayer Amschel Rothschild draws up plans for the creation of the Illuminati and entrusts Adam Weishaupt with its organization and development. Next, in 1791, the Rothschilds, through Alexander Hamilton, their agent in George Washington's cabinet, set up a central bank in the United States called the Bank of the United States. It was established with a 20-year charter. In 1811, the charter for the Rothschilds Bank of the United States ran out, and Congress voted against its renewal. At that time, Andrew Jackson, who would become the 7th President of the United States from 1829 to 1837, said, "If Congress has a right under the Constitution to issue paper money, it was given them to use by themselves, not to be delegated to individuals or corporations." Nathan Mayer Rothschild is not amused, and he stated, "Either the application for renewal of the charter is granted, or the United States will find itself involved in a most disastrous war." Andrew Jackson's response to Nathan Mayer Rothschild is the following: "You are a den of thieves, vipers, and I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God I will rout you out." Nathan Mayer Rothschild's reply to Andrew Jackson's comment was, "Teach those impudent Americans a lesson, bring them back to colonial status." Then in 1812, backed by the Rothschilds' money, the British declare war on the United States. The Rothschilds' plan was to cause the United States to build up such debt in fighting this war that they would have to surrender to the Rothschilds and allow the charter for the Rothschilds' own Bank of the United States to be renewed. In 1835, President Andrew Jackson starts depositing federal funds into banks directed by Democratic bankers rather than in the Rothschilds-controlled Bank of the United States. As a result, an assassination attempt is made on President Jackson, and he would later claim that he knew the Rothschilds were responsible for that attempted assassination. Then in 1845, Andrew Jackson dies. This great American patriot leaves instruction in his will to write on his tombstone, "I have killed the bank," a reference to the fact that he banished the Rothschilds' second central bank in the United States in 1836. Now in 1861, President Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president from 1860 to his assassination in 1865, approaches the Rothschilds to try to obtain loans to support the ongoing American Civil War. The Rothschilds agree, provided Lincoln allows them a charter for another United States central bank and is prepared to pay 24 to 36% interest on all monies loaned. Lincoln became very angry about the Rothschilds' proposal, wanting to charge such high level of interest, so he printed his own debt-free money and informed the public that this was now legal tender for both public and private debts. By April 1862, there was nearly 4.5 million Lincolnbacks printed and distributed. Lincoln went on to say, "We gave the people of this republic the greatest blessing they ever had, their own paper money to pay their own debts." Then in 1865, in an editorial in the Times of London that represented the viewpoints of the Rothschilds' banking empire, the editorial said the following: "If that mischievous financial policy which had its origin in the North American Republic should ever become indurated down to a fixture, then that government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off debts and be without a debt. It will have all the money necessary to carry on its commerce. It will become prosperous beyond precedent in the history of civilized governments of the world. The brains and the wealth of all countries will go to North America. That government must be destroyed, or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe." In 1865, in addressing Congress, President Abraham Lincoln said, "I have two great enemies, the Southern Army in front of me and the financial institution in the rear. Of the two, the one in the rear is my greatest foe." Later that year, President Lincoln is assassinated. Then in 1881, President James Garfield said, "Whoever controls the volume of money in our country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. And when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled one way or another by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate." Next, we're going to discuss the background which led to the creation of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, which established a private central bank in the United States. The Panic of 1907, also known as the 1907 Bankers' Panic, was a financial crisis that took place in the United States over a 3-week period starting in mid-October, when the New York Stock Exchange fell almost 50% from its peak the previous year. Panic occurred as this was during a time of economic recession, and there were numerous runs on banks and trust companies. The 1907 panic eventually spread throughout the nation when many state and local banks and businesses entered bankruptcy. Primary causes of the run included a retraction of market liquidity by a number of New York City banks and a loss of confidence among depositors. In the aftermath of the Panic of 1907, Republican Senator Nelson Aldrich, father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., put forth a plan through the National Monetary Commission to establish a central banking system that would issue currency and provide oversight and loans to the nation's banks, which led to the creation of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. So who was Senator Nelson Aldrich? Nelson Aldrich lived from 1841 to 1915, and he was a prominent American politician and leader of the Republican Party in the United States Senate, where he served from 1881 to 1911. By the 1890s, he was one of the big four key Republicans who largely controlled the major decisions of the Senate. His daughter, Abigail, married John D. Rockefeller Jr. Her sons included Nelson Rockefeller, Winthrop Rockefeller, and banker David Rockefeller. Aldrich worked with several key bankers and economists to design a plan in 1911 for an American central bank. This work included a trip to Jekyll Island in 1910 to have a meeting which resulted in draft legislation which originally was called the Aldrich Plan, which ultimately got negotiated and modified and led to the 1913 Federal Reserve Act signed by President Woodrow Wilson. The bankers and economists that Aldrich worked with included Paul Warburg, who is regarded as the father of the Federal Reserve, he himself being part of the Jekyll Island meeting in 1910, who was an agent of the Rothschilds in the United States and partner of the banking house Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and later became director of the Council on Foreign Relations from 1921 to 1932. Abram Andrew, an assistant secretary of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip, president of the Rockefeller-owned New York National City Bank, and Henry Davison of J.P. Morgan and Company were also part of the 1910 Jekyll Island group that helped to draft legislation which ultimately became the 1913 Federal Reserve Act. Senator Nelson Aldrich was very active in Freemasonry, where he first became a member in 1866. He belonged to the Royal Arch Chapter in the Cavalry Commandery of Knights Templars in Providence, Rhode Island. He was treasurer of the Grand Lodge of Rhode Island. So the Panic of 1907 led to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The Federal Reserve Act was passed by the 63rd United States Congress and signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson on December the 23rd, 1913. The Federal Reserve Act created the Federal Reserve System, consisting of 12 regional Federal Reserve banks jointly responsible for managing the country's money supply, making loans, and providing oversight to banks and serving as a lender of last resort. To lead the Federal Reserve System, the Act established the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, members of which are appointed by the President. The Federal Reserve Act created a national currency. With the passing of the Federal Reserve Act, Congress required that all nationally chartered banks become members of the Federal Reserve System. Regarding the significance of the passing of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, Senator Nelson Aldrich said, "Before passage of the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, the New York bankers could only dominate the monetary reserves of New York. But now we are able to dominate the bank reserves of the entire United States." On December the 22nd, 1913, on the dawn of the passing of the Federal Reserve Act, Congressman Charles Lindbergh, a Republican representative of Minnesota, said the following: "When the President signs this act, the invisible government by the money power, proven to exist by the monetary trust investigation, will be legalized. The new law will create inflation whenever the trusts want inflation. From now on, depressions will be scientifically created." After Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, he lamented that he did so, as he said these words in 1919, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction in the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." So the Federal Reserve banking system functions and operates based upon the principle of fractional reserve banking. Since 1980, all depository institutions have been required to set aside reserves with the Federal Reserve. This is called fractional reserve banking. Fractional reserve banking is the most common form of banking practiced by commercial banks worldwide. It involves banks accepting deposits from customers and making loans to borrowers while holding in reserve an amount equal to only a fraction of the bank's deposit liabilities. Bank reserves are held as cash in the bank or as balances in the bank's account at the central bank. The minimum amount that banks are required to hold in liquid assets is determined by the country's central bank and is called the reserve requirement. Banks working on the expectation that only a proportion of depositors will seek to withdraw funds at the same time keep only a fraction of their liabilities as reserves. Thus, they can experience an unexpected bank run when depositors wish to withdraw more funds than the reserves held by the bank. In that event, the country's central bank may act as lender of last resort to provide banks with funds to cover the short-term shortfall. Therefore, from these things, we can see that there is a financial elite, and the financial elite have a pyramid by which they operate and conduct their business. Next, we're going to share with you a variety of quotes from different people regarding their thoughts and views on private central banks. The first is from Thomas Jefferson in 1802, where he says, "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered." The next quote is from the founder of the Ford Motor Company, Henry Ford. He says, "It is well enough that people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe that there would be a revolution before morning." The next quote comes from John Maynard Keynes. And John Maynard Keynes is a prominent economist, and he says, "By this means," referring to fractional reserve banking, "government may secretly and unobserved confiscate the wealth of the people, and not one man in a million will detect the theft." The next quote comes from Milton Friedman. He is another prominent economist of our generation. And he says, "The Federal Reserve, the privately owned U.S. central bank, definitely caused the Great Depression by contracting the amount of currency in circulation by 1/3 from 1929 to 1933. So now in the next chart, let's see what Milton Friedman was referring to. Because in this chart, we can see the money supply from the years 1900 to 1942. And from looking at this chart, we can see that beginning from the end of 1929 to 1933, the money supply in the United States contracted. And according to Milton Friedman, it contracted by 1/3. It was in the years 1932 and 1933 when we had the lowest point of the contraction of the money supply is when we had the highest rate of unemployment during the Great Depression. As one point in the Great Depression, unemployment reached nearly 25%. So it was not only Milton Friedman who identified that the Federal Reserve's contracting of the money supply caused the Great Depression, but in 1932, Louis McFadden moved to induce charges against the Federal Reserve Board, blaming them for causing the crash and fueling the Depression because they contracted the money supply. So Louis McFadden said the following: "The Great Depression was not accidental. It was a carefully contrived occurrence, worked out just as one works out a mathematical equation. The international bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair so that they might emerge as the rulers of us all." U.S. President John F. Kennedy wanted to eliminate the Federal Reserve. On June the 4th, 1963, President Kennedy signed Executive Order 11,110, whose intent was to return to the U.S. government the power to issue currency without going through the Rothschilds' Federal Reserve. As a result, on November the 22nd, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated. So next I'm going to share with you a quote from Georgetown professor Dr. Carroll Quigley from his book Tragedy and Hope in Chapter 20. Dr. Quigley was a mentor of U.S. President Bill Clinton. He says, "The powers of financial capitalism to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world, controlled by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences." So let's summarize what we've covered in this section of our teaching. Number 1, Adam Weishaupt founded the secret society known as the Illuminati on May 1st, 1776 in Bavaria, Germany. Number 2, Bohemian Grove is a private men's club located in California who are members of the global elite. Their symbol is the owl. Number 3, Lilith is interpreted in the Bible as an owl who is a demon goddess. Number 4, in 1785, the Bavarian Illuminati started a branch in the United States. Its lodge was called Columbia. Number 5, with the birth of the United States, the goddess Columbia became the female personification and symbol of the United States. Number 6, the movie studio Columbia Pictures adopted the goddess Columbia as its logo in 1924. Number 7, the formal legal name of the media company, CBS, was Columbia Broadcasting System. Its logo became the Illuminati symbol, the all-seeing eye. Number 8, the modern method of banking can be traced back to medieval and early Renaissance Italy. Number 9, the original banks were merchant banks. Persecuted Jews living in Christian European countries were attracted to the trade. Number 10, court Jews were Jewish bankers or businessmen who lent money and handled the finances of some of the Christian European noble houses, primarily in the 17th and 18th centuries. Number 11, in the late 17th century, the largest centers for commerce were located in the cities of Amsterdam, Holland, London, England, and Hamburg, Germany. Number 12. In the late 18th century, the Rothschild family of German Jewish origin created a banking empire that eventually had branches all over Europe. Number 13. Mayer Amschel Rothschild, who lived from 1744 to 1812, his name was originally Bauer, and he adopted the surname of Rothschild, taking that name from a sign with a red shield that hung over the door to his business establishment. Number 14. As a pioneer of international finance, Mayer Amschel Rothschild developed a finance house and spread his empire by installing each of his 5 sons as his agents in the 5 major financial centers of Europe. Number 15. These financial centers were located in Frankfurt, Germany, Vienna, Austria, London, England, Paris, France, and Naples, Italy. The 5 sons linked their branches and became the first banking entity to transcend national borders. Number 16. Mayer Amschel Rothschild was famously quoted as saying, "Give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who writes the laws." The Rothschilds were also Freemasons. Number 17. Since the birth of the United States in 1776, the Rothschilds tried to set up a national private central bank that they owned and would control. Number 18. In order to achieve that goal, they manipulated events to create the War of 1812, the Civil War in the 1860s, and the Panic of 1907. From these efforts, Presidents Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln were assassinated. Number 19. After the Panic of 1907, Republican Senator Nelson Aldrich worked with Rothschild's supported bankers. In a 1910 meeting at Jekyll Island, they designed a plan which ultimately was incorporated into the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, which created a private national central bank in the United States. Number 20. With the passing of the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, Congress required that all nationally chartered banks become members of the Federal Reserve System. Number 21. Commercial banks in the United States practice fractional reserve banking. Since 1980, all depository institutions have been required to set aside reserves with the Federal Reserve. Number 22. Fractional reserve banking involves banks accepting deposits from customers and making loans to borrowers while holding in reserve an amount equal to only a fraction of the bank's deposit liabilities. The exact reserve requirement is determined by the Federal Reserve. Number 23. Fractional reserve banking makes possible for there to be unexpected bank runs from depositors. In this case, the Federal Reserve may become the lender of last resort. Number 24. By manipulating the money supply, the Federal Reserve can create financial bubbles. By decreasing the money supply, the Federal Reserve helped to create the severity of the Great Depression in the United States in the 1930s. So given that Satan is the king of Babylon, we are seeing how the Babylonian system has many layers and many tentacles. And next, we're going to look at in greater detail political Babylon. First, we're going to look at the Bilderberg Group. The Bilderberg Group consists of between 120 and 150 people representing the international elite from various business, media, academic, political, and government areas. The first meeting took place in Hotel de Bilderberg in the Netherlands from May 29th to 31st, 1954. They primarily consist of members from the United States and Europe, and historically they have included David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger. Only the group's steering committee decides whom to invite. In most cases, participants are adherents to one world order governance, run by the top power elites. The meetings are held under the Chatham House rule, which states that participants are free to use the information received, but neither the identity nor the affiliation of the speaker or speakers, nor of any other participant may be revealed. Furthermore, no press coverage is permitted. According to author and investigative journalist David Estulin, he writes, regardless of its early mission, these people have created in time what amounts to a shadow world government, which has taken control over the national sovereignty of various countries in order to impose their own will. continuing with his quote. Eventually, the membership plans to establish complete control over financial institutions of the world, as they believe that this is the route to absolute control of the world's population. The group's grand design is for a one world government with a single global marketplace, policed by one world army, and financially regulated by one world central bank using one global currency. So next we're going to share with you regarding the Council on Foreign Relations organization. The Council on Foreign Relations was founded on July the 29th, 1921. It is headquartered in New York City, with an additional office in Washington, D.C. Its founding members included David Rockefeller, Paul Warburg, who, as you remember, is regarded as the father of the Federal Reserve, Edward House, and Allen Dulles. The CFR publishes the bi-monthly journal Foreign Affairs and runs the David Rockefeller Studies Program. Next, I'm going to share with you a detailed quote from one of the founders of the Council on Foreign Relations, Colonel Edward House. So in a private meeting with U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, Colonel Edward House declared the goal and the intent of the international bankers who established the Federal Reserve, as well as those who were founding members of the Trilateral Commission. He stated, "Very soon every American will be required to register their biological property in a national system designed to keep track of the people, and that will operate under the ancient system of pledging. By such methodology, we can compel people to submit to our agenda, which will affect our security as a chargeback for our fiat paper currency. Every American will be forced to register or suffer being able to work and earn a living. They will be our chattels or property, and we will hold the security interest over them forever. By operation of the law merchant under the scheme of secured transactions, Americans, by unknowingly or unwittingly delivering the bills of lading to us, will be rendered bankrupt and insolvent, secured by their pledges. They will be stripped of their rights and given a commercial value designed to make us a profit, and they will be none the wiser, for not one man in a million could ever figure out our plans. And if by accident one or two should figure it out, we have in our arsenal plausible deniability. After all, this is the only logical way to fund government, by floating liens and debts to the registrants in the form of benefits and privileges. This will inevitably reap us huge profits beyond our wildest expectation and leave every American a contributor to this fraud, which we will call social insurance. Without realizing it, every American will unknowingly be our servant, however begrudgingly. The people will become helpless and without any hope for their redemption, and we will employ the high office, meaning the presidency, of our dummy corporation, that is the United States, to foment this plot against America. In the late 1930s, the Ford Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation began contributing large amounts of money to the Council on Foreign Relations. In 1938, they created various committees on foreign relations funded by a grant from the Carnegie Corporation. Beginning in 1939 and lasting for 5 years, the Council achieved much greater prominence within the government and the State Department when it established the strictly confidential War and Peace Studies funded entirely by the Rockefeller Foundation. At that time, the Council on Foreign Relations ultimately produced 682 memoranda for the State Department, marked classified and circulated among the appropriate governmental departments. A critical study found that of 502 government officials surveyed from 1945 to 1972, more than half were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. During the Eisenhower administration, 40% of the top U.S. foreign policy officials were CFR members. Under President Harry Truman, 42% of the top posts were filled by council members. During the Kennedy administration, this number rose to 51% and peaked at 57% under the Johnson administration. Today, there are about 5,000 members, which has included senior politicians, more than a dozen secretaries of state, bankers, CIA directors, lawyers, professors, and senior media figures. So next, I'd like to share with you another quote from Georgetown professor Dr. Carroll Quigley from his book, Tragedy and Hope. The Council on Foreign Relations, or the CFR, is the American branch of a society which originated in England and believes that national boundaries should be obliterated and one world rule established. Next, I want to share with you a quote from John Rarick in 1971, who was a Democratic congressman from Louisiana. The Council on Foreign Relations is the establishment. Not only does it have influence and power in key decision-making positions at the highest levels of government to apply pressure from above, but it also announces and uses individuals and groups to bring pressure from below, to justify the high-level decisions by converting the U.S. from a sovereign constitutional republic into a servile member state of a one-world dictatorship. Next, I'm going to share with you a quote from the 1975 book, Kissinger on the Couch. And this quote comes from Admiral Chester Ward, where he says, "The main purpose of the Council on Foreign Relations is promoting the disarmament of U.S. sovereignty and national independence and submergence into an all-powerful one-world government." So now I'd like to share with you another quote from Admiral Chester Ward from Review of the News, April the 9th, 1980, page 37, where he says, "The most powerful cliques in these elitist groups," referring to the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, which we will cover next in this teaching, and others, have one objective, and that is to bring about the surrender of the sovereignty and independence of the United States of America. A second clique of international members in the Council on Foreign Relations comprises the Wall Street international bankers and their key agents. Primarily, they want the world banking monopoly from whatever power ends up in the control of global government. They would probably prefer that this be an all-powerful United Nations organization, but they are also prepared to deal with and for a one-world government controlled by communist entities if U.S. sovereignty is ever surrendered to them. So next, we're going to share with you regarding the Trilateral Commission organization. The Trilateral Commission was founded by David Rockefeller in July 1973 to foster closer cooperation between North America, Western Europe, and Japan in the areas of politics and economics. Trilateral means three-sided. Today, there is a North American group, a European group, and a Pacific Asian group. Founding members included Zbigniew Brzezinski, who became President Carter's National Security Advisor, George Franklin, Executive Director of the Council on Foreign Relations, Paul Volcker, and Alan Greenspan, both who later became heads of the Federal Reserve. Their first executive committee meeting took place in Tokyo in October 1973. Today, the Trilateral Commission has over 400 members. Membership is by invitation only. U.S. President Jimmy Carter was one of the nearly 60 founding members of the Trilateral Commission in 1973. At that time, Carter was the only Democratic governor chosen to be a founding member. In the late 1970s, many former Trilateral Commission members held senior positions in the cabinet of U.S. President Jimmy Carter. They included the positions of Secretary of State, Defense, and Treasury. On top of that, Carter placed over 25 other Trilateral members, that was over one-third of its U.S. members at the time, to senior administrative positions. Members over the years included Jimmy Carter, Walter Mondale, George Bush Sr., Dick Cheney, Bill Clinton, and Al Gore. Next, I'm going to share with you a quote from Zbigniew Brzezinski from his 1970 book, Between Two Ages. Remember, Brzezinski was a founding member of the Trilateral Commission, where he writes in his book, "The nation-state as a fundamental unit of man's organized life has ceased to be the principal creative force. International banks and multinational corporations are acting and planning in terms that are far in advance of the political concepts of the nation-state. This regionalization is in keeping with the trilateral plan, which calls for a gradual convergence of East and West, ultimately leading toward the goal of one world government. National sovereignty is no longer a viable concept." Next, I'd like to share with you another quote by Zbigniew Brzezinski regarding world government, where he said, "We cannot leap into world government through one quick step. The precondition for eventual and genuine globalization is progressive regionalization, because by that we move toward larger, more stable, more cooperative units." And now, another quote from Zbigniew Brzezinski from his 1970 book Between Two Ages, where he says, calling for a forging of communism with the West, Brzezinski said the ultimate goal is world government. Next, I'd like to share with you a quote from Congressman Larry McDonald in 1976, where he stated that the Rockefeller organizations want one world government. He says, the drive of the Rockefellers and their allies is to create a one world government combining supercapitalism and communism under the same tent, all under their control. Do I mean conspiracy? Yes, I do. I am convinced there is such a plot. International in scope, generations old in planning, and incredibly evil in intent. Next, I'd like to share with you a quote from Senator Barry Goldwater from his 1979 book, With No Apologies, where he states, David Rockefeller's newest international cabal, referring to the Trilateral Commission, is intended to be the vehicle for multinational consolidation of the commercial and banking interests by seizing control of the political government of the United States. The Trilateral Commission represents a skillful, coordinated effort to seize control and consolidate the four centers of power: political, monetary, intellectual, and ecclesiastical. Continuing from quoting from Senator Barry Goldwater from his 1979 book, With No Apologies, he continues on saying, all this is to be done in the interest of creating a more peaceful, more productive world community. What the trilateralists truly intend is the creation of a worldwide economic power superior to the political governments of the nation states involved. They believe the abundant materialism they propose to create will overwhelm existing differences. As managers and creators of the system, they will rule the future. Next, I'd like to share with you some quotes from the 1980 book by Holly Schklar entitled Trilateralism, where she says, trilateralism is the creed of an international ruling class whose locus of power is the global corporation. The owners and managers of global corporations view the entire world as their factory, farm, supermarket, and playground. The Trilateral Commission is seeking to strengthen and rationalize the world economy in their interest. Trilateralists look forward to a pseudo-post-national age in which social, economic, and political values originating in the trilateral regions are transformed into universal values. Expanding networks of like-minded governmental officials, businessmen, and technocrats, elite products of Western civilization, are to carry out national and international policy formation. Functionally, specific institutions with more technical focus and lesser public awareness are best suited for addressing international issues in the trilateral model. Trilateralists call this decision-making process piecemeal functionalism. No comprehensive blueprints would be proposed and debated, but bit and bit the overall trilateral design would take shape. Its functional components are to be adopted in more or less piecemeal fashion, lessening the chance that people will grasp the overall scheme and organize resistance. So next I'm going to share with you a 1922 quote from New York City Mayor John Hyland regarding the bankers' control of the U.S. government. He said, the real menace of our republic is this invisible government which, like a giant octopus, sprawls its slimy length over city, state, and nation. Like the octopus of real life, it operates under cover of a self-created screen. At the head of this octopus are the Rockefeller Standard Oil interests and a small group of powerful banking houses generally referred to as international bankers. This group of powerful international bankers virtually run the United States government for their own selfish purposes. They practically control both political parties. Next, I'd like to share with you another quote by Louis McFadden regarding the bankers controlling U.S. government. And one note regarding Congressman Louis McFadden is he survived 2 assassination attempts, but he died on October the 1st, 1936 at the age of 60 under suspicious circumstances. So he said, every effort has been made by the Federal Reserve to conceal its powers, but the truth is the Fed has usurped the government. It controls everything here in Congress and controls all foreign relations. It makes and breaks governments at will. And now a quote from U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt regarding the bankers' control of U.S. government, where he said in 1933, "The truth of the matter is, as you and I know, that a financial element in the large centers has owned the government ever since the days of Andrew Jackson." So we've shared with you regarding the Bilderberg Group, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Trilateral Commission. And now we're going to share with you regarding how the United Nations came into being and the goal that the founders had for the United Nations. The earliest concrete plan for a new world organization to replace the League of Nations, which was tried to be set up after World War I but was unsuccessful, began with the support of the U.S. State Department in 1939. The text of the Declaration of the United Nations was drafted by U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Roosevelt aide Harry Hopkins while meeting at the White House on December the 29th, 1941. During these meetings, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt was the chief promoter of the United Nations idea. Later, the U.S. State Department created a special subcommittee on post-war planning to advise Congress. In January 1943, Secretary of State Cordell Hull formed a steering committee composed of himself, Leo Pasvalsky, Isaiah Bowman, Sumner Wells, Norman Davis, and Morton Taylor. All these men, with the exception of Hull, were associated with the Council on Foreign Relations. Later known as the Informal Agenda Group, in March 1943 they drafted a formal proposal for the United Nations. It was Bowman, a founder of the Council on Foreign Relations, who first put forward the details of the plan. In August 1943, Congress produced a draft of the United Nations Charter. In June 1944, U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt approved the plan and announced it to the public. For President Roosevelt, creating the UN was the most important goal of the entire World War II war effort. At the Yalta Conference held February the 4th to the 11th, 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin of Russia agreed to the establishment of the United Nations as well as the structure of the United Nations Security Council. The Yalta Conference was the World War II meeting of the heads of government of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union to discuss the post-war reorganization of Germany and Europe. The United Nations convened for the first time in San Francisco in April 1945. Most of the members of the U.S. delegation were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. On June the 26th, 1945, 50 nations signed a charter to create the United Nations. On October the 24th, 1945, the United Nations was officially formed. At its first session on February the 14th, 1946, the United Nations General Assembly voted to establish its permanent headquarters in New York City. Nelson Rockefeller purchased a 17 and 18-acre piece of land along the East River in New York City for the site of the United Nations. The purchase was funded by Nelson's father, John D. Rockefeller, Jr. The new UN headquarters building officially opened on January the 9th, 1951. So now I'm going to share with you some quotes from different people regarding the United Nations. The first is from longtime TV news anchor Walter Cronkite. And he said the following: "We must strengthen the United Nations as a first step toward world government, patterned after our own government with a legislature, executive, and judiciary, and police to enforce its international laws and keep its peace." In a speech to Congress on September the 11th, 1990, President George Bush said, "Out of these troubled times, we have an objective, a new world order that can emerge. We are now in sight of a United Nations that performs as envisioned by its founders." Next is a quote from James Warburg. He is the son of Paul Warburg, who is regarded as the father of the Federal Reserve and a founding member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So in 1950, before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, James Warburg said the following: "We shall have world government, whether you like it or not, and it will come by conquest or consent." In David Rockefeller's book Memoirs, on page 405, he said, "Some even believe that we, that is the Rockefeller family, are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists or globalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. one world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I am proud of it. The same David Rockefeller said before the Trilateral Commission in June 1991, "We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subject to the bright lights of publicity during those early years. But the work is now much more sophisticated and advanced, and we are prepared to march towards a world government." So from David Rockefeller's quote, you can see that U.S. media helps facilitate the goal and the agenda of world government. And then David Rockefeller, in a statement to the United Nations Business Council, September the 23rd, 1994, said, "We are on the verge of a global transformation. All we need is the right major crisis, and the nations will accept the new world order." U.S. President John F. Kennedy wanted to expose the deep state elite, and he said the following 7 days before his assassination: "There's a plot in this country to enslave every man, woman, and child, and before I leave this high and noble office, I intend to expose this plot." So these things that we just shared with you, the banking system, the Federal Reserve and fractional reserve banking, and the different organizations, multinational companies, and established political organizations work together and have a goal of eventual one world government. Does the Bible have anything to say about what these people are planning and doing? The answer is yes. They are spoken of in James chapter 5, and they're called the rich men of the earth, where in James chapter 5 verses 1 and 2 it is written, "Go to now, ye rich men, weep and howl for your miseries that will come upon you. Your riches are corrupted. Your gold and silver is cankered. You have heaped treasure together for the last days. You have lived in pleasure on the earth and been wanton." Continuing in James chapter 5 verse 4, "Which is of you kept back by fraud. And the cries of them, and the things that you have done and planned, have entered into the ears of the Lord of hosts." And there's a reference to the Lord of hosts in what he's going to do and when he's going to do it in Isaiah chapter 13 verse 13. Which says, "Therefore I will shake the heavens and the earth, and shall remove out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger." So these people and entities who are the ruling elite, who have made themselves rich by fraud, and who have heaped treasure together in the last days, which James chapter 5 calls the rich men of the earth. In Psalm chapter 2, they're called the kings of the earth. And in Psalm chapter 2, we can see that the kings of the earth are working together to rebel against Yeshua. And as we've covered in this teaching, the kings of the earth are the agents of the king of Babylon, that is Satan, in the earth, to rebel against the Lord and his anointed one, or Messiah. So the rebellion of Lucifer in the beginning, when he rebelled against the throne of Yeshua before Adam and Eve was created in the Garden of Eden, he's repeating that rebellion in the earth through the kings of the earth, of which we've defined earlier in this teaching that the Bible identifies the kings of the earth with Esau. So let's see what Psalm chapter 2 has to say about the kings of the earth and their rebellion, and what the outcome will be. In Psalm chapter 2 verses 1 through 3 it is written, "Why do the nations rage and the people imagine a vain thing? For the kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed." And in the Hebrew, the word is Mashiach, or Messiah, that is Yeshua. "And they say, let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us." In other words, the kings of the earth do not want to submit and be obedient to the God of Israel in the ways of his kingdom and his commandments and his Torah. So at one level, we can see the application of the kings of the earth from Acts chapter 4, because Acts chapter 4 verse 26 is quoting from Psalm chapter 2 verse 2, where it says, "The kings of the earth stood up, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Messiah," that is Yeshua. The application that is made to Psalm 2:2 is the following in Acts chapter 4 verse 27. "For of a truth against your holy child Yeshua, whom you have anointed, Herod and Pontius Pilate." So in the list of those who have opposed Yeshua. Who is at the top of the list is Herod, who's of Esau, he's an Edomite, and Pontius Pilate, the governor of Rome. And we saw earlier from Obadiah chapter 1 that Esau is also associated with Rome. Furthermore, from the Torah anthology to the book of the 12 prophets, volume 1, page 481, quoting from the book of Obadiah, it explains how King Herod was from Esau, or he was an Edomite, and those who destroyed the second temple in the first century was the Romans, who was prophesied to do so in Obadiah chapter 1 and verse 11. So the commentary in the Torah anthology is as follows. The second temple was destroyed by Edom, Rome. They are referred to as the aliens, or strangers, from Obadiah chapter 1 verse 11, and that King Herod was from Esau, or an Edomite. So you remember historically, the literal Esau, he lived in Mount Seir, which was a place of cave dwellings. From Obadiah chapter 1, which is a prophecy written concerning Esau or Edom, we see here, it says of him that he lives or dwells or hides in caves. Obadiah chapter 1 verse 1, it is written, Thus says Yahweh Elohim concerning Edom or Esau. Continuing in Obadiah chapter 1 verse 3, The pride of your heart has deceived you, you that dwell in the clefts or the caves of the rock. So a characteristic of Edom or Esau is that he hides or dwells or he lives in caves. And in Revelation chapter 6 verse 15, it describes the kings of the earth, a reference to Psalm chapter 2 verse 2, as hiding in caves from the judgment of the Lord in the end of days, when he judges the kings of the earth, the rich men of the earth, in the day of his wrath and fierce anger. So in Revelation chapter 6 verse 15 it is written, And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every free man hid themselves in the dens, and in the rocks of the mountains. So now let's see the response of the Lord to Psalm chapter 2 verses 1 through 3, where once again the kings of the earth are conspiring or taking counsel and making plans to rebel against the Lord and his Messiah because they don't want anything to do with the Lord, Yeshua, and his ways. What does the Bible say is the God of Israel's response to the plans of the kings of the earth? Well, we're told in Psalm chapter 2 verse 4, He that sits in the heavens will laugh, and he will have them in derision. And then in Psalm chapter 2 verse 5, we're told that he's going to judge them in the time of his wrath, which is a reference to the time of the great tribulation in the day of the Lord. So in Psalm chapter 2 verse 5 it is written, Then shall he speak unto them in his wrath, and vex them in his sore displeasure. And what's going to be the outcome from the plot of the kings of the earth to rebel against the Lord and against his Messiah? The end result is the kings of the earth are going to be judged in the time of the wrath and the fierce anger of the Lord, which is the time of the great tribulation, and the coming of the day of the Lord, which is a reference to Yeshua's second coming, that ultimately the outcome of the battle is specified in Psalm chapter 2 verse 6. I have set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. So a major biblical principle is biblical history is prophecy. And where we're going in the future is back to where we started. So in the beginning, before Adam and Eve were created in the Garden of Eden, in eternity past, Yeshua sat on his throne on behalf of his Father's kingdom in the New Jerusalem, and he ruled and reigned upon the holy hill of Zion. But Lucifer rebelled against Yeshua and his throne. He was kicked out of the mountain of God. Yeshua creates the earth, creates Adam and Eve in the garden, and the rebellion which Satan did against the throne of Yeshua, he's going to repeat in the earth through the kings of the earth, and his agent by which he's going to work to cause the people on the earth to rebel against Yeshua is Esau. And Esau's ultimate world rebellion against Yeshua is through the kings of the earth and the rich men of the earth. So when Yeshua judges the rebellion of the kings of the earth and the rich men of the earth, he will continue to rule and reign from his throne on Mount Zion forever and ever. So let's summarize what we've covered in this last part of the teaching. Number 1, the Bilderberg Group was established in 1954. They consist of between 120 and 150 people representing the international elite from various business, media, academic, political, and governmental areas. Their goal is one world government. Number 2, the Council on Foreign Relations was founded in 1921 by David Rockefeller. His goal is one world government. Today there are about 5,000 members of the Council on Foreign Relations. From 1945 to 1972, anywhere from 40 to 50% of top U.S. government positions were held by members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Since then, many people running for President of the United States have been members, and many members still hold influential government positions. Number 3, the Trilateral Commission was founded by David Rockefeller in 1973. His goal is one world government. Today, it has over 400 members. Many of the original founding members held high governmental positions in the administration of President Jimmy Carter. The Trilateral Commission brings together members from North America, Western Europe, and Pacific Asia to work toward a one-world government. Number 4, in 1945, after World War II, the United Nations was established. Its founders envisioned that it would be the first step toward eventual world government. Number 5, in the Bible, in James chapter 5, it speaks of the rich men of the earth who have heaped treasure upon themselves in the last days. They will be judged by the God of Israel at his second coming. Number 6, Lucifer's original rebellion against the throne of Yeshua is being duplicated in the earth, as stated in Psalm chapter 2, through the kings of the earth, that would be Esau and his agents, who are seeking to rebel against the God of Israel and repel or not have his authority over them in governing their lives. And finally, number 7, in the conclusion of this study, the rebellion by Lucifer and the kings of the earth, referring to Esau and his agents, will fail, and they will be judged by Yeshua in the day of his wrath and fierce anger, which is associated with the great tribulation, the day of the Lord, and the events surrounding his second coming. And Yeshua will defeat the rebellion of Lucifer and the kings of the earth, and in doing so, Yeshua will sit on his throne, and he will rule and reign forever in the New Jerusalem on Mount Zion. So this is going to conclude our teaching on exposing the kingdom of darkness. Shalom in Yeshua the Messiah. Amen.